not one of the best WrestleManias of all time, but it did have one of the greatest matches of all time in WWE. And that is what we are going to be watching live on YouTube if you are a channel member. We're going to be doing our second live watch-along Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. That is the current planned time place. 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be watching Bret the Hitman Hart against Stone Cold Steve Austin, the submission match, and Shamrock as the referee. WrestleMania 13, so stop on by Wednesday afternoon, and then of course I'll be with you live Wednesday night for everybody for the usual Dynamite review. The wrestling business has lost a lot of people, well below where they're trying to go. People in their 30s, 40s, let alone their 50s and 60s. Some of those people, they lived a very hard lifestyle. That's just the reality of it. They came up in a different time, they had certain vices, and they lived a very hard lifestyle. And in some cases, it was less surprising to find out that they had passed away. You've heard of these celebrity death pools, who's going to be the next one to go. Really important stuff. Well, there were wrestling ones too. And two names that would always come up online at wrestling death pools were Jake the Snake Roberts and Scott. This is one of the two of them who were at their lowest. Rehab wasn't working. As Stephanie McMahon once told ESPN, the WWE spent 6 figures sending Scott Hall to rehab for all these years. It was the most amount of money that they ever spent on treatment for a single person. I believe he went to rehab 12 times. He claims he paid for the first 6 times. WWE paid for the next 6. But at least a dozen times, they sent him to rehab, and it just didn't stick. There were stories of them, the two of them showing up at independent shows, completely wasted, stumbling around. Not even just stories, but, recordings, videos that would be posted online of them stumbling around. And with Scott, of course, it was the infamous show in Fall River, Massachusetts. In 2011, that might have been the most infamous. He had just gotten out of the hospital. He barely able to stand. I think he still had the hospital tag around his wrist. Couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet. Had to be helped into the ring. Wearing his outsider's jacket, posing like he's cool. Meanwhile, he has no idea where he is. Clearly,
he was certainly left up.
It was embarrassing.
You know,
and as a fan, I grew up watching. I grew up watching Jake the Snake Roberts, and I grew up watching Grace or Ramon. You feel helpless to do anything about it. Like it's only a matter of time before you read about them being found dead in a hotel room or dead in the ring. God forbid, like Macho Man, keeling over at the wheel and driving up the road. And what can you do? These are grown adults who are going to do what they're going to do. You just hope that they don't hurt anybody else or take anybody else down with them. When Diamond Dallas Page decided that it was time to help Scott Hall, it was DDP, Jake Roberts, who by that point was already on the mend himself, doing better. Kevin Nash and Sean Waltman, they all came together to try to help their friend get his life back on track. When they got to Scott Hall, I'll never forget the phone call when DDP and Jake called and they played the audio of that call. He told Dallas, he goes, "Dally, I'm dying. He said he was drinking vodka for breakfast every day. He would sometimes call his friends on the phone and say goodbye after threatening to kill himself. When he went to finally go stay with Dallas, remember the video of him being wheeled through the airport in a wheelchair? He finally decided to go move in with DDP. Scott Hall at that point, as awful as he looked, was only 54 years old. And he had already been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. He had a pacemaker already implanted in his chest. He was taking 11 different medications every single day. And he was in desperate need of a hip replacement. So they set up an Indiegogo campaign to try to crowdfund the $80,000 that he needed for the surgery and therapy. They ended up raising over $109,000, well over their goal. And it really showed just how much of an impact he made on a lot of people. And so many of them came out to support him the way that they did. He got his hip fixed. He started doing DDP yoga. He got sober, although that didn't last. But he seemed to be in a much better place than he was. Grim Reaper was knocking on this man's door, and he kicked out. On March 1st, Jerry Jarrett posted on Facebook that he had gotten off the phone with Scott Hall and that Scott had fallen and broken his hip and he was in the hospital. When he fell, he was laying on the floor for days, unable to get to the phone until DDP went to go do basically a welfare check on him because nobody had talked to him for a few days. They were worried about him. They couldn't get a hold of him. And that's when he found Scott on the floor. He took him to the hospital. I don't know if it was the same hip that was replaced years earlier, but he went under the knife. And during that operation, there was a complication. A blood clot had gotten loose. He suffered 3 heart attacks, and he was placed on life support. And on Monday, his best friend, Kevin Nash, posted on Instagram that once Scott's family was all gathered in place, they were going to discontinue life support. He said, "I'm going to lose the one person on this planet that I've spent more of my life with than anyone else. My heart is broken, and I'm so very effing sad. I love Scott with all my heart, and now I have to prepare my life without him in the present. I've been blessed to have a friend that took me at face value, and I him. When we jumped to WCW, we didn't care who liked or hated us. We had each other, and with the smooth Barry Bloom, we changed wrestling both in content and pay for those a lot that disliked us. We were the outsiders, but we had each other. Scott always felt he wasn't worthy of the afterlife. Will God please have some gold-plated toothpicks for my brother? My life was enriched with his take on life. He wasn't perfect, but as he always said, last perfect person to walk the planet, they nailed to a cross. As we prepare for life without him, just remember there goes a great guy, and you ain't gonna see another one like him again. See you down the road, Scott. I couldn't love a human being any more than I do." Scott Hall passed away later that day. He was 63 years old. When I first read the news about him having the 3 heart attacks, being placed on life support, that was at the start of last week's podcast, I pretty much knew what the lead story was going to be on this week's show. You hope for the best, but you prepare for the worst. After everything that he had been through, all the bumps, all the partying, all the pills, all the booze, the heart issues, this man cheated death so many times. And in the end, it was a blood clot during surgery that did him. But the illusion that Scott Hall was back on the wagon and doing well, after his time with DDP, was pretty much shattered by Sean Waltman in The Observer this week when he said that the pandemic really did Scott in. The last 2 years were as bad as ever. Being isolated at home, not being able to get out and interact with anybody. There were certain conventions and appearances and stuff, although probably not many over the last 2 years. And it just really ate away at him. And he started drinking heavily again. Apparently, he passed out at the bar before last year's Hall of Fame when the NWO got inducted.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. So at American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
And there were stories of him not being in any condition to fulfill certain appearances and signings that he was supposed to do. I remember it may have been a virtual signing that he was supposed to do for High Spots that he missed, and because I was going to watch it. Occasionally I think they just happened with the Hardy Boys actually the other day. If I'm in the middle of just working on stuff or whatever, and I hear this virtual signing going on, occasionally I'll, click on the Facebook video. It's just the wrestler, usually with the owner of High Spot, Michael Bukikio, just sitting at a table and signing various items and telling stories and stuff. And I remember hearing Scott Hall was going to do one, and he wasn't there. And they said, today's not a good day for Scott. And you kind of knew what that meant. Scott Hall, for all the progress that he made all those years ago, in the last 2 years of his life, had fallen right back into that black hole. And a lot of his problems can be traced back to the fact that both of his parents, his grandparents, his father in particular, were all alcoholics. He's from a family of alcoholics. So I know it's shocking that when you're from a family of alcoholics like he was, that you end up becoming an alcoholic yourself. But that's really where a lot of his problems can be traced back to. It explains a lot. Forced him to grow up a lot quicker. And there was also the shooting incident as well, but he himself has said in certain interviews that, he would go to rehab and finally they were trying to get to the root cause of what the issue was. Because for all those times WWE would pay to send him to rehab, again, 12 times, he said, I took it seriously, I went, I did the classes, I listened, I participated, but it just didn't work for me, it didn't stick. Until finally they said, you're trying to treat the symptoms here, something that is underlying. You treat the symptoms all you want, you're not going to get to the root cause of the problem. You got to get to the root cause of what's causing you to drink and do all this stuff in the first place. And that's when he felt like he was starting to finally make headway. And he goes, yeah, the shooting incident was one thing, but he really said that it goes back to, again, his family history of this stuff. But there was an incident that also played a role. Back when he was 25 years old, he was bartending at a strip club. He talked about it publicly for the first time, or one of the first times, in his E60 documentary a number of years ago. That's the first time I had ever heard him talking about this story. As he told it, he got into an argument with another man. It was over a woman, according to what else is new. The guy went outside. This is according to Hall. The guy went outside and smashed all the windows on Scott's car. And when Scott went outside, the bouncer, he's like, where is he? And the bouncer says, over there. He slugged the guy. The guy went down, his shirt went up, and Hall noticed him reaching for a gun. And Scott tried to wrestle the gun away from him. He took the gun, and then he aimed it at the guy's head, and he fired one shot, point blank, and he killed him. What he didn't say in that documentary, and this comes from an article in the Orlando Sentinel the day after the incident, is that the man he shot and killed was a manager at the club, basically his boss, and that the woman that they were fighting over was the man's wife, who Scott had allegedly been seeing on the side behind the guy's back. That's according to another employee who worked at the club. And the manager had threatened to kill them both. And when Hall got to the club for work that night, he pulled his car in, and when he got out, the manager was there to confront him with a gun. And what's even crazier is that the man that Scott killed, he himself shot somebody dead the month before that. He shot and killed a guy that he claimed had attacked him after making advances towards his wife. And it was ruled a justifiable homicide. Sounds like a jealous husband to me. But in any event, that's the event that really set Scott Hall up for a life of addiction, because he never sought the help that he needed after what he did. And Hall was charged with second-degree murder, and the case was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence. He said years later he didn't know any better. He should have sought counseling after what happened, but he never did. He just tried to bury it. But you can't run away from something like that. That shit'll chase you all the way to the very end. That's enough to mess with anybody's head. My first exposure to Scott Hall was in the WWF as Razor Ramon. I didn't see him as part of American Starship with Danny Spivey, or his stint in the AWA as Big Scott Hall with the porn stash, or as the Diamond Stud in WCW. For me, it started with the vignettes they shot in Miami to build to his debut. Which were some great vignettes, not the best that WWE ever did. I still say the best that WWE ever did. It's either the Mr. Perfect vignettes or the $1 Million Man ones. One of those two. But the Razor Ramon ones were great. And he had the accent and the toothpick and the gold chain. He was doing the Tony Montana character from Scarface. And when he came to the WWF, he asked Vince McMahon if he had ever seen Scarface before. Vince said no. Vince McMahon was deep into the bubble for him not to have known about Scarface. I'm surprised he didn't have them put scars all over the man's face when he debuted. Now, I know it sounds ridiculous now, but as a 10-year-old, I didn't know any better. He sounded Cuban to me. If you look back at it now, having seen him dress like a cowboy years earlier, speaking in his normal accent, it sounds preposterous. But Razor Ramon was cool. The name sounded cool, he looked cool, he carried himself like a star. He had a cool finisher. Up until a few years ago, I couldn't even think of a single time anybody had ever kicked out of the Razor's Edge. At least in WWE. I could not think of a single instance in which anybody had kicked out of that move. And this was back when finishers were largely protected, unlike today. And I thought, man, in all those years, nobody ever kicked out of the Razor's Edge. And then the illusion was shattered when I saw a video of a match that he had with Crush on an episode of All American Wrestling in 1993. Kona Crush, babyface Crush. And I'll be damned, Crush kicked out of the Razor's Edge. But, even in that case, it was a delayed cover by Razor. He gloated for about 7 or 8 seconds before going for the pin. But I guess I can't say that anymore. The other thing I always loved about Scott Hall were his punches. He had one of the best working punches that I have ever seen. Jerry Lawler. Lawler is probably the best that I have ever seen throw a punch in wrestling. Yeah, Jerry Lawler. Bret Hart is another one that I think of. And Scott Hall would be right at the top of that list. Jeff Jarrett threw a pretty good punch, too. Vader, I just talked about Vader last week going into the Hall of Fame. I don't even consider those punches. I don't even know what word I would use for those. Strikes? But those were no normal punches from Vader. I'm not really sure how worked those were. But again, his shit looked good when he was in the ring. And when he first came into the WWF, it was surprising how quickly, even to a young fan who I only knew of what I saw on TV, but it was weird. This new guy had just debuted, and how quickly he was vaulted into the main event picture. He debuted on television in August. He actually wrestled Carmella's father in his debut, Paul Van Dale. 1 month later, he cost Randy Savage the WWF title when he lost it back to Ric Flair. And by November, he was in one of the 2 main events at Survivor Series, tagging with Ric Flair against Randy Savage.
Oh, shit. Big 10.
2 months after that, he was wrestling Bret Hart for the WWF title at the Royal Rumble. And they had a pretty good match, despite the fact that, Hall blew his knee out a few weeks before the match. Could have been even better if he wasn't hurt. But a few months later in May, he did the job to Sean Waltman, one of the most famous matches in the history of Monday Night Raw. That was the birth of the 1-2-3 Kid. He made Sean Waltman. In a single night, he made Sean Waltman. And by the following month, the fans were starting to turn him babyface. So they did a little test. They put Razor in the ring with Shawn Michaels. It was heel against heel. You didn't see that very often in that period of the WWF. Heel against heel. At Madison Square Garden in a live event. This was in June of 1993. And Hall fully expected that he would be the one getting booed over Shawn. And, in fact, the exact opposite happened, which shocked him. And at that point, they started the angle on TV with Ted DiBiase, kind of mocking Razor, and he lost to this kid, and that led to the Razor Ramon babyface turn. That's what he was until the day he left the company in 1996. He was a fan favorite.
At Arizona State University, we made online education better, smarter, and more personalized, so you could go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 300 programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
18.
When I think of the stars of
Oh,
that new
boy.
generation era of the WWF, the first two names that always come to mind, kind of the leaders of that new generation, were Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. They were the top two stars. But then there was The Undertaker, there was Diesel, and there was Razor Ramon. So this guy was one of the faces of my childhood. You know, for me, it started with the Golden Era, and then it was the New Generation Era. I even started my own wrestling magazine. I called it New Generation Magazine back in 1996. I didn't realize this until a few days ago. I was putting my notes together, and it was 28 years ago to this very day, as I am sitting here right now on March 20th, 1994, that WrestleMania 10 was held in Madison Square Garden, which featured the first of two famous ladder matches between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon. This was the more famous of the two. People don't really talk about the SummerSlam one as much as I think we should. I actually thought that was the better of the two matches. But this is the iconic one. And it ended with that image of Razor standing on the ladder holding up both Intercontinental belts. It's a legendary match. It's such a basic ladder match compared to the stunt shows that we see today, but it's a product of its time. It was the first one that ever aired on television or pay-per-view. You didn't have to do too much. It was still a novelty at the time. The novelty has long since worn off when it comes to ladder matches. We've seen so many of them. And now they try to squeeze as many people as possible into 6, 7, 8 people flying around all over the place. But they always replay Shawn Michaels doing a big splash off the top of the ladder. But honestly, the spot in that match that stays with me the most, there's a part of the match where Razor is up against the ropes. He's facing the crowd. He's selling. He's in so much pain. Hall's selling was incredible in that match. And Shawn Michaels, you see him in the background. He picks up the ladder above his head, and he just chucks it at Razor Ramon. He throws it halfway across the ring, and it hits him right in the spine. Even now, when I watch it back, that looks so painful. You can't work a spot like that. You can't work a ladder in a spot like that when it's flying halfway across the ring. He took that thing to the spine like a champ. But those two, they worked so well together. And it makes me really sad to think back to the video that WWE did for their YouTube channel a few years ago. They got Shawn and Scott to sit down together and watch back the highlights of that match. It was 25 years after the ladder match. So they sat down to rewatch it. At the very end of that video, you can probably still find it. I'm sure it's still up on their channel. At the very end of that video, Scott turns to Shawn and he says, "This has been fun." He goes, "Let's do it again in another 25 years." I was just thinking about that the other day. And so that's tough. But I've said this before. Again, I enjoyed their second ladder match at SummerSlam in '95 more than I did the WrestleMania one. When I think of that classic Intercontinental title, there are certain people that I associate with that belt. Mr. Perfect is probably the first one that I think of, but Razor Ramon is right there with him. 4 times he held that championship. The more I think about it, as far as Intercontinental champs of the 90s are concerned, I might just put Razor Ramon at the top at number 1. When he left the WWF in 1996, Jesus Christ, I mean, who knew the chain of events that it would set off? It started with Hall leaving. That was the catalyst for everything that came after that. Scott Hall left first, Kevin Nash followed, and from that came this idea that, Eric Bischoff wanted to use for an invasion, basically. And once Bischoff got Hogan on board and that third man, we ended up with the greatest storyline in wrestling history. Most successful.
Shit.
It's the one from which everything else followed in the Attitude Era. Scott Hall walking out on Monday Nitro for the first time is one of the most important segments in the history of the business. Think about the chain of events that it set off. Not only in WCW, but in WWE as well. What led to those 83 weeks that WCW beat WWE in the ratings? It's the whole reason Eric Bischoff even has a fucking podcast these days called 83 Weeks. You can trace it back to that moment. It's what pushed Vince McMahon back on his heels and forced him to make a change to his product. It led to the biggest boom period in wrestling history. I remember watching live that night. I bought into the hype that, hey, maybe there really is a crossover going on here. You really weren't sure, but you wanted to believe it because it's what every wrestling fan wanted to see at that time. Every wrestling fan wanted to see WWF against WCW. Or in their mind, they fantasy booked what matches they would do on a big supercard if we ever got WWF against WCW. An interpromotional war. All the dream matches you thought you would never see. It made things exciting. It made those shows on Monday night must-see. It had me flipping channels back and forth every 5 minutes. I only had one VCR, so I could only tape one show. This was the challenge back then, no DVR, no YouTube. Scott Hall has the distinction of being part of some of the most memorable moments in wrestling. The ladder match with Shawn Michaels at Madison Square Garden. The curtain call, also in Madison Square Garden. That first segment he did on Nitro. And Bash at the Beach, 96, when Hogan joined the NWO, and all three of them celebrated in the ring, being pelted with garbage.
Whoa.
So whether you like the guy or not, I'm not saying the guy was a saint, because he wasn't. But you can't deny his place in history and how big of a deal Scott Hall was during that time. I mentioned Razor losing to the 1-2-3 Kid as one of the most famous matches in Raw history. When the NWO came to WWE in 2002, they did a match on Raw 6 days before WrestleMania. It was 20 years ago this month. A match that I still can't believe they gave away for free with barely any build or promotion. It was Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash against Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock in a handicap match. So you can make that two of the most famous matches in Monday Night Raw history that Scott Hall was a part of. The star power in that match was insane. The only time Hulk Hogan and Steve Austin ever wrestled each other was in that match. And Hall was chosen to wrestle Austin at WrestleMania that year. The people were probably taking bets as to how long he was going to last. The answer was not very long. Not very long at all. Not even 2 months later, within days of the infamous plane ride from hell, the company fired him. And that was the last big run of his career. He did go to TNA. He spent some time in TNA for a few years after that, but he didn't do anything of note, certainly nothing positive, of note in wrestling after that. Once that last stint was done, and it was very brief in WWE in 2002, that was really the end of Scott Hall as a major player in a major promotion. When he was on tour in New Japan, even before that, in 2001, he went on tour in New Japan. Hall put over a young lion by the name of Hiroshi Tanahashi and told anybody who would listen that night, that kid is money. Tanahashi never forgot that. He once said that Scott Hall was a big deal in America. I was always a fan of his. I remember watching his matches with Shawn Michaels in the WWF over and over. A classical type. He had the flashiness of the character where it counted, and a classical style when it came to getting it done in the ring. Remember Wrestle Kingdom this year? And the match that Tanahashi had with Kenta? The splash that Tanahashi did off the ladder? I said, what is that? What is that splash? That form on the splash as he came up? What does that remind you of? I said, Tanahashi was a big Shawn Michaels fan. It would not have surprised me if he did that on purpose as a tribute to that match. Well, he wasn't just a fan of Shawn Michaels, he's a fan of Scott Hall as well. And that's just one of many ways that you can tell how much that ladder match influenced so many that came after that. Not to mention, of course, all the TLC matches that we got years later. Those two guys in that match, that was the inspiration for so much of what came later on. I think it is fair to include Scott Hall's name on the list as one of the best to never have been a world champion. I would not put him above Roddy Piper on that list. Scott Hall would not be number one. Because Piper was just an incredible heel, especially back around 84, 85. WWE absolutely could have had Hogan chasing Piper for the world title if they wanted, and they still would have sold a lot of tickets and made a lot of money doing so. Hall, though, he had all the tools to be champion. He had the look, he had the size, he could work. The time to do it, if you were ever going to put a world title on Scott Hall, I think the only realistic time to have done so would have been in late 1994. And that means that instead of going with Kevin Nash and going with Diesel as your chosen one, Vince could have gone with Razor Ramon. I think Razor Ramon was popular enough that if they were willing to take a chance on Diesel, who up to that point had been a heel, mostly a bodyguard, part-time wrestler, but had been a heel, then certainly there was no more risk in trying Razor Ramon to see how well he would have done. But, outside of that period, he was never going to be a world champion. In WCW, his issues outside of the ring, they never would have allowed it. He was his own worst enemy. But honestly, even though he could have been a world champ for a few months at some point in his career, forget Diesel for a second, because we all know why Vince went with Kevin Nash. There's 7 feet worth of reasons why. Put him on the side for a second. But the reason he was never going to be a world champion anywhere, look at who was on top in that era in the WWF. Who were the top 2 guys in that company? Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. And Scott Hall was not better than Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels. I'm sorry, he wasn't. In WCW, who was on top? They had Hogan. Scott came in just as Hogan was turned heel. That heel turn breathed new life into Hulk Hogan. That added at least 5 years onto Hogan's career. Did that heel turn. So you had heel Hollywood Hogan on top, who was easily the biggest star they had. You had Sting. Later on, you had Goldberg during that period where he was white hot. You couldn't argue his success and how over he was. When those 3 were on top and at their hottest in that company, Scott Hall was not bigger than any of those people. He was not bigger than Goldberg at his peak. He was not bigger than Sting. And he certainly was not bigger than Hogan. So while he had the tools to carry the top title, I think he could have done it. He wasn't better than the best. And I think that's the point that people miss with not just Scott Hall, but certain other people who might have been really, really good, but were they better than the best? Whether it be business-wise, whether it be their work in the ring, he was never better than the best at that time. It's just the way that it was. So it never worked out that way for him. There's also the story that Hall told before. I mentioned Sting a moment ago. And I have to mention it because this is always wild to me, but there's the story that Hall told before about being the one to suggest the Crow gimmick for Sting. Sting had never seen the movie before. He didn't know about the Crow character. The actual story of how the Crow came to be is a little bit different, as told by Mark Madden on Jim Ross's old Ross Report podcast in 2014. Madden worked behind the scenes for WCW at the time. Even before he became an on-air announcer for them, he was doing magazine and hotline stuff behind the scenes of the company. And as he told it, there was a young woman who worked for WCW who had a fetish, I guess you would say, for the Crow. Her boyfriend also worked for WCW at the time. I don't know what wrestler may have been with her. One night, to surprise her, said wrestler, I'm assuming it was one of the wrestlers, decided to have one of the WCW makeup artists apply the Crow makeup to his face before he went to her hotel room that night. Fast forward a few days or weeks later, whatever it was, there's a conversation going on backstage about what to do with Sting. And it was Scott Hall who said, hey, what about that wacky makeup that so-and-so wore when he went to his girl's room the other night? And Madden goes, what, you mean the Crow makeup? And again, as he tells the story, Scott didn't know anything about the movie. He had no idea. All he knew was that the makeup looked cool. But from that's how Sting ended up as the Crow. And evidently, that was the story that went around the locker room at that time, or some variation of that story that Madden told. And so that is more likely the actual sequence of events as far as how the Crow came to be. It wasn't necessarily a case where Scott Hall was, he went to go see the movie and he loved it so much, or he loved Brandon Lee in the movie so much that he said, hey, you see that movie? You should dress up like Brandon Lee. Doesn't sound like he knew what it was either, but at least he had enough sense to say, hey, Sting might look cool if he were to wear that makeup. And without Paul mentioning that, there is no Crow Sting, and it was that version of Sting sitting up in the rafters and rappelling down from the rafters that was such a big part of that Monday Night War era. When I think of the best matches of Scott Hall's career, the two biggest matches of his career were the first ladder match at WrestleMania and the six-man tag match at the Beach, the night that Hogan joined the NWO. It's not even up for debate. Those are the two biggest matches of the man's career. But his best matches, that's a whole different ball of wax. His best matches, there's three of them at the top of my list. And these are not ranked in any particular order, but these are, in my opinion, the three best Scott Hall matches. All three, by the way, happen to involve Shawn Michaels. First ladder match with Shawn. The second ladder match with Shawn. And there was a tag team match that aired on an episode of Action Zone in 1994. All four members of the Clique. It was Diesel and Shawn Michaels against Razor Ramon and the 1-2-3 Kid. The pace of that match always stood out to me, how quick it was, how fast it was. One of the best tag team matches that you will ever see. And it was Sean Waltman in one of his shoot interviews. It may have been the one with Sean Oliver, who sort of hinted that Scott had a lot to do with laying that match out and putting that match together as great as it was. But here's a couple more that you should definitely make the time to check out. Because I got a lot of questions about that. What Scott Hall matches would you recommend? Or what are his top 3, his top 5, his top 10? Here's a few more for you to chew on. His Monday Night Raw match with Rick Martel in 1993 when he won his first Intercontinental title. I remember that being a pretty good match. His Monday Night Raw match in August of 94 against Shawn Michaels. That was Shawn's first match back since WrestleMania.
Download initiated.
Basically a break. He was
Stop
managing
Black Tusk
Diesel
from obtaining the data
entire
directly from the
length of
vault.
that spring and summer, and then finally he was back in the ring and he wrestled Razor on Raw. And as great as their matches were with a ladder involved, this was just a straight single match, and it was every bit as good as the other. That is a great, great match to go from. They did not leave any gimmicks. Had a great match. So I was happy that Scott got his moment at the Hall of Fame to give his own speech in 2014. So many others never get that chance if they go in. The Hall of Fame means different things to different people. But if you are selected to go in, at the very least, it's your mindset that I don't care about the Hall of Fame. It's all just a figment of Vince McMahon's imagination. Where is it? Vince McMahon wants to be. And all of that is true. But at the very least, you want to be able to give your own acceptance. Vader is going into the Hall of Fame this year. He died for the chance.
What's making this?
That's Scott Hall, by all rights, never should have made it onto the stage. And not because he didn't deserve it. But he turned things around. Not only did he get inducted into the Hall of Fame for Razor Ramon, he got inducted the second time to part of the end. How many people can you think of that have effectively had two careers and had the kind of impact of those two careers that Scott Hall had? He was a big star in WWF as a Razor Ramon, and then went on under his real name to have this entirely different career for himself that was arguably even bigger than hers. Not too many people in this. That's why he's in the Hall of Fame.
50% complete.
The closing line of his Hall of Fame speech is so great. It deserves to be repeated one more time. I think it's a great way to sum up the life and the career of Scott Hall. Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last. Bad times. Tony Khan made his weekly appearance on Busted Open Radio Friday morning. He announced his plans to relaunch Ring of Honor's weekly television show coming out of Supercard of Honor pay-per-view next month. He said even though Supercard of Honor runs head-to-head with AEW Rampage that he is still forging ahead with the show because it was set prior to his purchasing the company and they had already sold tickets for it, so he doesn't want to upset those
75%
fans.
complete.
He says he sees it as a transitional show, beginning launching from the hopes to be a new Ring of Honor TV product, which is simply a weekly series wherever it does air or stream, is what he said. He gave no further details on where that might be. And he also said there would be a cool way to utilize select members of the AEW roster at the pay-per-view on April 1st. However, he does not plan on AEW or Ring of Honor airing that on television or wherever on the same night in the future, which anybody with a brain could have figured out.
I got you.
Why the hell would he
Oh, shit.
CM Punk and Bryan Danielson, they're on the AEW roster. And that is where they should be.
Download
Although I
complete.
find them
Well done.
Goddamn.
Now finish securing the building.
honored in their history, but Punk and Danielson, they belong where they are in AEW, but I still say Tony Khan should bring Samoa Joe and Samoa Joe. I mean, it's inevitable. It's just a matter of time before Samoa Joe ends up signing some sort of deal with Tony Khan, whatever the role ends up being. I think he should bring in Joe and or Cesaro and get them involved in some way on the Ring of Honor side. Because that brand is going to need a few days. Now that we know
For the
show
data.
is moving
Might be
full
interference
steam
with the
ahead as far as
structure.
running Ring of Honor
Make your way back
as
topside.
its own separate entity. And he's made that very clear. He's going to relaunch the show. He's going to soon start selling tickets to certain shows. Either of those two men would be a great addition, given that they both have a history in Ring of Honor. And as busy as things are right now with the existing AEW roster, I'm not so sure that them just going to AEW is really such a great move right now. They have a lot of people they've signed. They have a lot of people already on the roster. You know, they're going to add Joe and Claudio and Gargano. Who knows who else, right? Ember Moon is still out there. How many
Why
more
is this
people can
playing
they
in the
add?
background, this
There's
noise?
only so many spots to go around on TV. Well, now
Ready up to now?
Ring of Honor. He's got a whole other promotion. And there just so happens to be some of these free agent names out there right now who have a history in Ring of Honor.
Can't see that.
Tim, ready up to now?
And if you're going to run a television show and want people to tune in and want to give them a reason to watch the show, you've got to have some names on the show. Joe is a name. Cesaro would be a name who just had 10 or 11 years of television exposure on WWE television. Built up a lot of goodwill with the audience. People like that. I also think Tony Khan had somebody like Kate Sapolsky or somebody who works with him behind the scenes at AEW who he thinks might have some booking chops. Because I fear that this guy is spreading something.
Still can't get a clean signal. Something's throwing up interference.
Looks like Black Tusk might have set up some kind of jamming device on the catwalk.
Speaking of that Supercard of Honor show, you made an official on Twitter that on Friday that Briscoe is going to get their match with FTR on that show. April 1st. Perfect time to get that match.
By yourself, no, I know. And have reached a working agreement to bring DDT wrestlers to the United
States for the first time in AEW. DDT and Bert Kenny Omega first made an AEW himself. Bert Kenny Omega usually at last
System
matches.
curtailed.
Legendary Yoshi. And final sex though. Oh yes. Those on fire.
System restored. System malfunctioning.
By a D-drop that caused its basically exploded. That was a second version of the
System back online. System curtailed. System activated. System malfunctioning.
Maybe we'll get another version of Yoshi.
System restored.
AEW set the mark this past week. One of the largest gates outside. Las Vegas on May 29th. Almost 13,000 tickets sold for a gate of over $1.1 million. That just finished out the marketing convention supercard edition. And that was with fans from all over the world, traveling in for WrestleMania. This is more impressive to me because there is no wrestling. This is an AEW exclusive weekend of things.
Device deactivated.
Tickets were made for the show.
Data transfer stream open.
Vegas for the first time since the original.
Handshake authenticated.
Show.
Transfer initiated. 25% complete.
Party's going on here, bro.
Huh?
Oh, it's cool. You know it's cool.
75% complete.
Oh, that ran out blood.
This helps that buddy.
Complete.
Huh?
Data transfer stream closed.
Leg. Now clean up the rest of the black tusk and we can call today a win.
Dude, that helped immensely. Sweet.
We'll get you a new, on that.
Between Roman Reigns and Jeff Hardy, they have to do that match before WrestleMania. You could have easily gotten one pay-per-view match at least that. Out of a Jeff Hardy comeback story, tries to win one last major championship. His first universal title before ultimately losing to Roman Reigns.
Snores.
And it's a match that he himself said he really wanted to see off. That's the match that I want to wrestle Roman Reigns. But he says, things felt really good that night in Survivor Series because they were actually doing something with him. Most of the time, he wasn't doing anything. He didn't feel valued. He talked about being at SummerSlam when they were at Allegiant Stadium in Vegas last year. Now he's second in Vegas and SummerSlam was a big stadium. He had no match. He ended up not even being on the card. He was only in this show. And he was ended up hanging out there the whole time. He was like backstage. What am I eating? What am I eating? Not just entertaining. What am I doing?
System disrupted.
That last night, he said,
System activated.
I'll say it again, because everyone, you know about WWE, right?
You have received an endorsement.
Jeff said it all worked out in the end. Now WWE.
We'll need to go through the data to figure out what Black Tusk was after. But the important thing is that we got it and they didn't. Well done.
Waiting for 90 days to expire about wanting to put the whole thing. They dangled that carrot in front of him. And he said he actually felt offended by it. He was actually kind of pissed off and angry. So he felt like now it's not fun, all that fun, okay? And, you know, he's not sure, he says, what their reaction would have been if he would have asked them, hey, what happened to the AEW was for 90 days, bro? Are you still going to want to put me in the Hall of Fame this year? And then Matt chimed in and said it's more like they were offering him the Hall of Fame as a way to get him to stay, which, of course, that's what it was. I don't know why Jeff would think otherwise. That's exactly what they fucking did. WWE is not calling Jeff Hardy weeks after they fired him about putting him in their Hall of Fame and they know he's
feel like we've had enough fighting or not?
It was a very transparent attempt to get him to stay. And Jeff wisely, in so many words, told them to one. And you know, Jeff said he doesn't really care so much about the Hall of Fame. That's not really what matters. Whatever does happen. So much so that there's going to be a second episode. They'll pump out a second one that focuses more on his wrestling. But this was incredible to listen to. I never knew the extent of the health issues that he had. I knew about his heart. I knew about his neck. I knew about how sick years and years and years ago he got on that tour in India, which is, I think, why WWE didn't go back to India for so many years. He wasn't the only one to get sick on that tour. I want to say that was maybe 2002. So I knew about certain, episodes like that in his career and in his life, but the extent of those health issues and how close he came to dying on more than one occasion, it's unbelievable. He talked about getting pericarditis back in the late 90s.
Good.
It's an inflammation of the protective sac around your heart and how it can scar up that sac. It's not a good thing. I perked up when I heard
Hostile control point nearby.
For 3 days a few years back with pericarditis. We talked about it on a podcast at the time, back in 2017. And it was the worst pain that I ever experienced in my life. And it was more of oppression. And it felt like an element was sitting on my chest. I felt like I was having a heart attack. Apparently it mirrors or can mirror the symptoms of a heart attack. So that's what it felt like. And I can tell you, it does not feel
We got another guy playing with me right now, bro.
so it was very scary to talk about that. In this case,
No, a real person. That's not cool.
he said he broke his neck in a match with Ricky Steamboat in WCW in 1993, and he never knew it. He never knew his neck was broken. All those years, Lord Steven Regal.
To all the children, mothers, fathers, grandparents, friends, families, all of you that were treated like animals on Roosevelt Island, I swear, the outcasts will burn every last one of those responsible. We've all endured suffering, but only now
Detected.
what it means to feel deserted.
Progress halted.
In each arm,
Manual override required.
10 years. They didn't even know what the doctor said.
Hostage health is critical.
Finally, she had it operated. Anyway,
The true sons of
All hostages are deceased. Fitness resumed. Civilians in distress.
WWE in Costa Rica gets dizzy, gets off the plane, gets dizzy with his guitar, and he says, I want to by that point, and he fell down escalator at the airport. He shattered the left eye socket.
This is super easy when you got a real person playing with you, bro.
He lost 100% of vision in his left eye.
Not as you can see.
He was still having health issues months later. They saw something on a scan. Turns out that sack around his heart, back around that sack around his heart had completely calcified. And they told him, if we don't operate to remove the calcified areas, you have less than 6 months left to live. You will not be here 6 months. And he had nothing but praise for WWE, saying they paid for everything, including sending him to a specialist in Atlanta, who was one of the premier doctors in the entire country, one of the few, to have successfully treated this. He spent 8 weeks in the hospital after that, but he insisted on going home for Christmas and wanted to be with his family. And that was a mistake. Because on New Year's Day, this would have been 2019.
Oh, I just did. Well, we did. Let's go.
Hell out of it. His wife and his son got him into an ambulance and rushed him to the hospital, where he then
Use your modifier.
developed sepsis in his leg. He got an infection, and the doctors called his wife to tell her that if we don't amputate this guy's leg right away, he's going to be dead within 24 hours. Lucky for him, it just so happened that the wife of one of his usual doctors, who I guess wasn't in that day, the wife was also a doctor. She overheard that phone call. She was in the background. She heard what was going on, so she tells her husband what's going on. So Regal's regular doctor, he quickly calls into the hospital and says, don't do this. He stopped them from amputating his leg. And I guess whatever he told them to do, they were able to save the leg. Which just goes to show you that every doctor doesn't necessarily know what the fuck they're talking about. You know, listening to him tell these stories, it was about an hour or 20 minutes in the episode. I listened to the entire thing.
Reinforcements en route.
I felt like I needed them. I listened to him so much. It's insane. He was in that hospital and they saved his leg. That was amazing. And within 2 months, he had 5 months left. So instead of now, his health is just within a year.
Well, it's good to have.
Thunder Rosa won the AEW World Championship from Britt Baker in their steel cage match Wednesday night in Rosa's hometown of San Antonio. 1 year after their Lights Out match, they headlined their second online show. They brought back the blood, they brought back the contacts, and they out. It was a great moment, and I don't think the company is too, I think,
Funny, Cole. Very strong.
else. Britt probably was on a fight shaming hater. Very weird. This was happening right there.
Detected. Planted by hostiles.
I think Serena beat after that challenge for the championship. She's been doing these 5-minute professor challenges.
Incoming hostiles detected.
They come behind us, come around us, behind us, behind us.